Hello. If you look at your programme, you'll see that the person who was supposed to be talking now was Charlie Flanagan. So I'll get in first by doing the line that says that I know Charlie Flanagan and Denis Bradley, you're no Charlie Flanagan. But I am standing in it.
Switch at the bottom. One more thing. No, you haven't yet. Speak and see.
Time's up.
One. Yeah, there it is. Okay.
It was you, Connor, it wasn't me.
It's the ghost of Charlie Flanagan.
Yeah. I had a prepared speech. I have been coming to things like the MacGill Summer School off and on over the years. And I love summer schools when they're good and when they're vibrant and when they're pertinent. And I was going to give a speech, which I think I've given in other places, which I think is neither vibrant nor pertinent. So I am not now going to give the speech that I was going to give. And the reason for that is because of Brendan Howland. I think when somebody, a politician in particular, stands up and gives a tour de force and gives something that is incredibly important, then it deserves a response. Because I think that the core of what he says brings this debate to where it needs to be and where it should be, and describes it as well as I have ever heard it described. So I'm going to try to respond off the cuff to that speech. I would blame the Department of Justice 90% for the refusal and for the slowness of doing the job that needs to be done. The first meeting, I think, one of the first meetings I ever had when I became Vice Chair of the Policing Board in Northern Ireland was with the Department of Justice, with some of its senior officials. And they encouraged us, they welcomed us on board, they encouraged us, they pointed out the enormity of the task that we were about to undertake, and they talked about the importance and the centrality of that task, that was probably the last and core issue in bringing peace to Northern Ireland, was the transformation of policing, and it was going to be within our hands. And it was a very momentous and memorable occasion. And for the next 5, 6 years, I kept meeting the Department of Justice, different people in its various manifestations and incarnations. And sometimes I felt they were like a ghost that stalked us, because they turned up at most events, sometimes in the form of a junior person and quite often in the form of a fairly senior civil servant. So I got to know them over that period of time. And I began, as I got more confident and a little bit more cocky, to actually propose that perhaps they could look at this reform or that reform that might fit in with, that might coalesce, that might have some echoing of what we were trying to do with the PSNI, with the new established policing service. And I might as well have been talking to Methuselah, because it appeared to me that around the policing issue, they had assumed that when they went to sleep, whatever period of time, and when they woke up, things were exactly the same, and that there was no need for reform within their golden constituency. I found that slightly strange, but I wasn't perhaps initially all that concerned, because I am one of those people who grew up in Donegal with a major admiration for what has been achieved in this country. And if you're looking for a good book on that, don't go beyond Connor's, because Connor has written about the about the history of policing within this state. But within the 5 or 6 years that I spent around policing, I also was visited or had to visit places like France and Belgium and Holland, and had incoming visitors from Honolulu and from Sri Lanka and from all kinds of weird and wonderful places. And all of them without exception, would have given anything for what we had in Ireland, for the inherited position that policing had gifted us within this country, that our police service was integrated into our community, that policing was part of whom we were, that our police lived in most parts of our communities, and that they were the sons and daughters of this community, and that they were respected and accepted and highly regarded, both as a profession and as personal individuals. And that most of those countries, without exception, all of those countries without exception, would have given so much to have that. And during those years I began to detect, slowly but detected, that there were problems within the police service, that there were problems within the Gardaí. And of course the Morris Tribunal was a revelation, was a stark, ugly revelation. Ugly in the sense that it was telling us something that we had kind of hidden from ourselves. And when governments, and particularly the Department of Justices, do not respond to that, then you begin to think, perhaps things are not as good as they should be. Perhaps things are not where they were. I blame the department for a second thing. That when the people who worked hard within politics to actually recognize that reform was necessary, that reform needed to be part, and that the people within the Garda Síochána itself, and I used to meet them quite often, ordinary men and women within the Garda Síochána who were walking the streets, who used to say, we're getting out of touch with a whole lot of things. I don't know my commissioner anymore. I don't know my superintendent anymore. They spend half or most of their time in Dublin. We're getting bogged down with bureaucracy, but we're losing our touch. We're losing our togetherness with our community. Things are happening and we don't know always why we're happening. Or they were telling me, you see the car I drive around on, you wouldn't put it out into the bog to collect turf because it may not go another 10 yards. Or they were telling us that actually the equipment that they were given was not good enough, was not up to modern standards. And the thing that they held on to and always held on to was that our people know us and we know our people. And we are grateful for that. But in all other aspects of living, as life becomes more complicated, as it becomes more diverse within the criminal justice system, as all these new things and difficult things are being imposed upon our community, we're not keeping up to speed with it. We're not actually either receiving the support or the training. And it began to become clearer and clearer and clearer that a problem existed and that that problem was increasing. And yet nothing happened. And when the question was asked, why isn't it happening? The answer was, don't you worry about it. We're okay down here. We're all right down here. And down here meant that we are not the same as you up in the north. Well, up in the north, we were doing something about it. And what we were doing about it was actually implementing things that were important. And we were not the same as in Garda Síochána. And we didn't have the same problems as in Garda Síochána. Because in some ways, there was clarity in the north as to what the problem was. And the problem was that a police service had over the years become over-identified with one particular aspect of the community, one particular aspect of a political community, and not nearly well enough identified with the other. And secondly, we had that police service had been militarized during a period of 40 years of trouble. So we had to demilitarize it and integrated into the totality of the community, and that was the task. The question was, who was going to do it? And quite often when I come to seminars, I hear people talk about we. And I want to ask the question, who was we? Because bringing about change is incredibly difficult. Bringing about change doesn't happen because we make speeches. Bringing about change is a daily, weekly, monthly grind. But the important and one core aspect of it is you need to know who we are. Who is responsible? Who is the person or the organization who has the task of bringing about the change? And what was clear in the north of Ireland was it wasn't Her Majesty's Inspectorate, important as they were. It wasn't the police ombudsman, important as he or she was. It was the policing board. The genius of Patton was that it simplified who was responsible for what. The difficulty with the Department of Justice and the reforms that have happened or have not happened here is that we have never clarified who is responsible for bringing about what change. And when you actually look at the structures that have been put into place over the last 10 years, is that they resemble, they echo, they parallel what happened in Northern Ireland. There is now an inspectorate, there is now an ombudsman's office, and there is a policing authority. So why hasn't it happened? Well, Brendan put his hand on it. We're great at making about the change and then not giving the people the authority and the wherewithal to bring actually the change into being. Because the policing authority in no way represents what a policing authority should be. And I will give you 2 examples of that. A policing board in Northern Ireland appoints and sacks, or at least has the power to sack, those people it employs. And I have found that if you really want to change something, there's nothing better than for the people you want to change to know that you can employ them and that you can sack them. That's a core change mechanism. And you see if you don't have it, then go whistle in the wind. That is a core change. It shocked me when I read the policing authority legislation that they hadn't been given that power. Brendan pointed that out. You cannot bring the change about unless you do that. And the second thing I want to point out is that if Patton is such a golden thing as I think he is, laid a golden egg, as the Patton report is, and when it talked about the policing board, and when it constructed the policing board, it talked about the same thing that was talked about here, which was taking politics or policing out of politics, about taking policing out of politics. Well, that's the most foolish statement that any human being could make. It is impossible to take policing out of politics. Policing is one of the most political things any organization, any political party, or any government will ever do. And no government will ever give up its role and its ultimate authority about the policing within a country. That is not what is meant, actually, when people, I think, indulge themselves within this conversation. The secret is because it is impossible, if it is impossible to bring policing out of politics and politics out of policing, then what do you do? What you must do is to get as much political buy-in to the policing reforms and to the policing structures as you possibly can achieve. And the difference in Northern Ireland Policing Board and the policing authority here is that every political party in Northern Ireland is represented on the policing board. And what we have here in the policing authority presently is 7 good men and women who are ultimately a quango. Because if you do not have politics involved in that core issue of policing, then you're talking quango land. Because the country and the police service being given the power, the incredible power that they are given, is actually a representation of the power of that country. And you cannot divulge that from politics. The great thing that the policing board in Northern Ireland achieved was integrating and managing the diverse political opinions and views and statements and mission statements of the political parties in Northern Ireland. And they did that with good leadership, but also with 7 or 8 good individual citizens who got in among the politicians and who challenged them when necessary and who gave them cover when that was necessary. A policing board, it appears to me, without giving ownership to the diverse political parties and the diverse political views within a country, cannot have the credibility it should have. And I think it was a major mistake in the legislation not to actually put your political representatives on the board. How it happens in Northern Ireland is the political parties will have the amount of representation according to their electoral success. If they won so much votes, they will get 2 seats. If they won so many, they will get 3 seats. And the management of that, it seems to me, is vital. Otherwise, what you end up with is what we have ended up with. Every politician from Cork to Donegal, and every political party and every political committee talking and having their say on policing, and yet nobody knowing who is the authority, apart from that the government holds on to the power to sack the commissioner. Now, where does that leave us? It leaves us in a situation whereby I think we have to make very, very quick decisions. I was against. I set my face against the new commission at Connor, and I was going to say Sergeant O'Toole there for a second. I better go above the sergeant. That Kathleen and Connor are now on. I think we put good people on that commission. But that commission is going to end up deciding about nuanced situations. Should we integrate intelligence or not? That's an important argument, but it's a nuanced argument. What is really necessary is to begin to give back confidence to our police service. I do not know how a young police officer can any longer have any real faith in the organisation he or she is serving. It's a disgrace what we are doing. And the political people in this country and the government at this moment of time needs to know that it needs to make this thing happen now, and it needs to make it fast. It needs to make it happen fast. And the only people who can make it happen are the policing authority. And they must be given the responsibility and the power to make it happen. And the second thing is that they need to get more courageous than what they have shown up to now. Josephine, the chairperson, went on radio about 4 months ago. Josephine, you're very welcome. And you spoke to the nation, and the nation listened, and the nation settled itself for about 2 months. The nation is now in turmoil again. The policing authority needs to be the voice of the community. It needs to be representative of the totality of the community, and it needs to speak on behalf of the whole community. It is poised to be part of the Garda body. It needs to be part of whom the Gardaí are. And it needs to critique the Gardaí, to drive the changes that are necessary, but it also needs to understand the Gardaí and its difficulties and its low morale at the present, and it needs to speak on their behalf, and it needs to tell the politicians, get off our back and give us the space to make the reforms that are necessary, and we will do it within a couple of years. You are the only people who can do it. And you see if the politicians get in the way, then tell them to get lost or you will get out of here. It happened. The crisis, I finished with this, the biggest crisis that the PSNI ever faced was the first 3 months of its existence when the board came into existence. Nuala alone had published a report on Omagh, most horrendous situation. It nearly pulled the board apart. But the board got its act together, and for 3 days we chaired, with all the political parties, we chaired a round-table situation to bring out a report to respond to that horrible situation. In the midst of it, the senior officer within the Northern Ireland office arrived in the policing board to tell I and another couple of people that we needed to be careful what we were doing. And they were duly escorted off the premises. It is time that the policing authority duly escorted a number of people off the premises and get on with the work that is necessary. Thank you.